On the one hand, technology is incredible because it gives us the opportunity to live stream the entire service. So that way, if you can't be here, you can still participate in what's going on here at the church. On the other hand, it creates another thing that could go wrong on any given Sunday. So we do apologize that the audio cut out during the live stream. We're not really sure why it did. We're hoping to figure that out and get it fixed before next Sunday for you. But I thought I'd go ahead and re-record the sermon for you today so that way you don't miss out on that, because I know that sometimes Sunday is the best day for us to be able to keep caught up on what's going on. But I think that enough time has passed that it's okay for us to collectively answer the question that I'm about to ask you. What a great way to start, isn't it? We are coming up on 6 years since the start of the global pandemic. And if you can think back to those early days of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, whatever that meant, you may recall that all of us were looking for things to do, ways to keep us entertained, ways to help us just continue to function, because the whole world shut down for a couple of weeks. We couldn't really go anywhere or do anything, and in some cases we couldn't even look at certain people. So I want to ask you this question. What did you do to keep yourself amused? How did you entertain yourself during the first days of the global pandemic? And when I think about the earliest days for myself, I can really only think of two specific words that kind of sum up how I was able to stay entertained during the pandemic. And when I say those two words, I'm going to guess that for some of you, it's going to conjure up some feelings of nostalgia, maybe, or at the very least, it's going to ring true for you, even though you might not want to express that it rings true. Those two words of how I kept myself entertained are summed up in Tiger King. You may recall that Tiger King was a series of documentaries, on Netflix that followed a guy by the name of Joe Exotic. Joe ran a small zoo in Oklahoma that specialized in, what else? Tigers. It'd be kind of weird if it was koala bears or something like that, and they still called it Tiger King. But he ran this small zoo, and Joe Exotic himself, if you don't know what he looks like, he kind of looks like if the actor Michael Keaton got really into heavy drugs and country music. But the show revealed some less than ethical ways that Joe himself would deal with his staff, his family, and the tigers themselves. At no point really does the show give you any sort of indication that Joe Exotic is a good guy. Even though he is the main focus of the documentary, he's not presented as being the hero of the story that they're laying out. Through the show, we also learn about Joe's seeming main rival, Carol Baskins. Joe is, let's say, overtly clear about his feelings towards Carol. And Carol herself owns and operates a private wildlife preserve that seems to try to rescue some of these cats and tigers that are kept in unhealthy environments. If you didn't know already, apparently owning a tiger is a lot more affordable than you might think it is. But not everybody treats them the way that they need to be treated. And so Carol's organization tries to rescue as many tigers as they possibly can. So you can kind of see why Joe would be at odds with Carol. And it's right around the time that you start to think that, hey, maybe Carol is the one I need to be rooting for. Maybe she is the good guy in this whole story, that we learn that Carol, at least, the documentary seems to at least indicate that Carol may have had a hand in her first husband's disappearance. Carol herself manages to imply that she knows how to use tigers to get rid of a body. So obviously you can't really root for Carol in the midst of all of this. And it starts to make you wonder, who am I supposed to be rooting for in this documentary? And then every other person that this documentary introduces us to is seemingly more morally reprehensible than the last person that the documentary introduced us to. And it starts to leave us wondering who it is that we're supposed to root for. But all the while, just can't help but keep watching. And it's that very thing as to why I think the show may have been so compelling for so many of us during the pandemic. There is something about us that we tend to be captivated by seeing people that we view as, let's say, terrible people, having drama with other people that we might also classify as being awful. If you don't believe me, if you think that that's weird that I would say it that way, then I got to ask you, why are soap operas, why have they been so popular since even before television was invented? Why is daytime talk television, shows like Maury and Jerry Springer and all sorts of other ones, why are they still popular today? There's just something about us that is truly fascinated by watching two or more morally ambiguous people have a contentious disagreement of some kind, whether that be verbal or physical, because we get to sit back and kind of get lost in the melodrama. Like, we know we're not supposed to be rooting for anybody here. We really even know that we probably shouldn't be watching this. But there's just something of a guilty pleasure that comes in watching as two awful people duke it out against one another. And I think that's why today's part of Jacob's story is just so fascinating to me. Like, the entire story of Jacob is an interesting story, otherwise we wouldn't be focusing on it. That'd be kind of a weird thing to spend your entire sermons talking about the most boring guy in Scripture. But this particular text that we come to today, it makes me wish I just had like a big old bowl of popcorn or something to watch as this drama unfolds. This story has everything, to be completely honest with you. It's got two snakes trying to outsnake each other. It's got drama. It's got intrigue. It's got manipulation. It's got gaslighting. It's got deception. It has stolen items. It has ancient animal husbandry practices. And I said it does have everything. We're going to be covering Genesis 30 and 31 today. So if you want to get there in your Bible or open it up on your app or however you want to get to it. But I want to let you know this is kind of a long, but also a very messy part of Scripture. See, when we left things off with Jacob in the narrative, he had finally arrived in Haran. He had finally met his uncle Laban. He had fallen head over heels for Rachel. To the point that he and Laban eventually came to an agreement with one another in Genesis 29, verse 18. It says, Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And we talked about the romantic elements of this particular narrative, that as he was working for 7 years, it didn't feel like a very long time to Jacob because he was just so in love with Rachel and could not wait for the day to be able to marry her. And that's when the narrative kind of takes a turn, because his uncle, the day after his wedding, Jacob realized his uncle has tricked him. It says in verse 25, and in the morning, behold, it was Leah. I mean, the text doesn't say gasp, but, I think it should be there. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Laban tricks Jacob into marrying the daughter that he did not want to marry necessarily. But he also tells Jacob that if you agree to work for me for another 7 years, then I'll let you marry Rachel next week. Laban has already shown us in a very short amount of time in Scripture that he is not to be trusted at all. But we also did point out the idea that this narrative kind of serves as a little bit of comeuppance for Jacob. I mean, Jacob has not exactly been an innocent, root-worthy character for us throughout this entire narrative. Jacob has, been able to manipulate his brother into selling his birthright for a bowl of bean stew. Yeah, that's never not going to be ridiculous to me. But he also manipulated and coerced his father, capitalizing on his disability of being unable to see, to be able to get the blessing that was always meant for his brother as well. And his brother has now decided that I want to end Jacob's life. So to see as Laban has deceived the deceiver, it kind of feels a little bit justified. Like this little slice of humble pie was warranted. But this wouldn't be the only time that Laban deceives Jacob. When we left things off, we discussed that Leah, the forgotten wife of Jacob, was about as fertile as one can be this side of getting a show on TLC. But Rachel, the wife that Jacob actually loved, Rachel herself struggled with conception. She seemed to be unable to bear children for her husband. And she pleaded over and over with God to make her be able to give her husband a son, to be able to have children of her own, to be able to experience that joy in her life. And it wouldn't be until we get to Genesis 30, verse 22 through 24, that we find out that Rachel finally is able to birth a child. It says this, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, 'God has taken away my reproach.' And she called his name Joseph, saying, 'May the Lord add to me another son.'" It's kind of interesting to me that Rachel, as soon as God has listened to her prayer, God has heard her pleading with him to give her a son, as soon as she holds that little boy, the only thing that she can think is, I want more. It's interesting. Do me a favor and file that away in the back of your brain, because I promise you this is going to come up later on in the drama that's about to unfold. Because as soon as Joseph is born, and the text seems to indicate that this is nearing the end of the 14 years that Jacob has now worked for Laban, Jacob has kind of decided he's done now, and he wants to go off and do his own thing. He's asking Laban to let him go home, possibly to collect on that birthright, but more than anything, to kind of just start his own thing, to get away from just making Laban money. And we're going to learn as the text goes on that Jacob has been responsible for Laban going from not very wealthy at all to incredibly wealthy. So he asks in verse 26 of chapter 30, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." Essentially, Jacob is telling Laban here that I've served you diligently, but I want to go and do my own thing. He has his own family now to build and to grow. At this point in time in the text, Jacob has 11 sons as well as daughters. And the grocery bills kind of get kind of high. So he wants to make sure that any money that he's bringing in go to benefit him and his family. I don't think this is an unreasonable request. I doubt that you do as well, because that's ultimately what we all want, is to provide for our families. As a husband and a father myself, I want to make sure that my wife and my children are taken care of. And I work hard to make sure that that's happening for them. And that's all that Jacob is asking for himself. But Laban is a little reluctant to let Jacob just go away. Again, understand, Jacob has been helping produce livestock over and over again. And when we talk about the ancient cultures, the reason why livestock gets mentioned so much is we got to keep in mind, this is an agricultural-based economy. There's not really any money outside of gold and silver. The true indicator of wealth and stock in your community is how much livestock you have. It's how many lambs and sheep and servants are working for you, and all of these other markers that indicate whether or not somebody is wealthy. When Jacob first showed up, Laban wasn't really all that wealthy, but he has seen Jacob work, and he has seen Jacob do incredible things, and now he is incredibly wealthy. It's almost like Laban views Jacob as the proverbial golden goose. So he's not really in a hurry to let him go. So he tries to gaslight him a little bit with this request. He says in verses 27 and 28, it says, "But Laban said to him, 'If I have found favor in your sight, I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it.'" A couple things in those verses that we have to look at. First off, Laban says that he's learned by divination that God is at work in Jacob's life. Essentially what Laban says there is, hey, I checked in with my gods, and my gods tell me that your God has been working through you, that I've been blessed because of what your God has done in you. Kind of interesting that he would need other gods to tell him what should be pretty obvious, right? But the second thing we got to look at, that last little line there where Laban says, "Name your wages. That should stick out like a sore thumb to us, especially after last week, because where's the other time that we've heard Laban say, name your wages? Right before he double-crossed Jacob for the first time by swapping out Rachel for Leah. So this is essentially Laban trying to gaslight Jacob into giving him even more free labor. What a guy, right? Jacob at first, he seems to see this for exactly what it is. And he tries to reason with Laban in the midst of all of this to say that Laban's already benefited more than he could have ever expected from Jacob's work. He says in verse 30, "For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?" Again, Jacob is saying that Laban himself has seen God blessing Laban through Jacob's efforts. Everything that Jacob has touched has turned to gold for Laban. Laban is a far wealthier man now than he was 14 years ago when Joseph first showed up. And it's all been because of what Jacob has done. I said Joseph, didn't I? It's all been because of what Jacob has done in the midst of all of this stuff. He is working so diligently for Laban. And Laban is making money, essentially, hand over fist. I mean, the reality is he's getting livestock hand over fist. That's a weird way to phrase livestock. But anyway, he's not excited to let Jacob just go. Right, and we kind of see this still some today. If you're an employee for a corporation and you're making that corporation all kinds of money, they're going to do whatever they can to keep you. Right? They'll throw you different pay packages. They'll throw you different bonuses. They'll give you vacations. They'll do whatever they can to try to keep you happy because you're making them money. All Jacob is asking for is an opportunity to make money for himself. That's it. And so Laban is saying, name your wages, so that he can kind of keep Jacob there. Because right now, Jacob is just tired of his work only benefiting Laban, not himself. But Laban's not done here. Again, he's going to try to do everything he can to hold on to Jacob for as long as possible. He's not going to let the golden goose just leave. Or at least that's what he's trying to make it seem like. He claims that he doesn't want Jacob to just leave with nothing. That Jacob's worked too hard for him. That Jacob has just done too much for him to feel comfortable just letting Jacob leave. So he says so he again asked Jacob what he should give him for all of this service. And you can almost hear, again, the text doesn't have it. I think it should be there, but you can hear Jacob's exasperated sigh when he sees what we read starting at the end of verse 31, going all the way through verse 33. Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you'll do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all of your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages." And then before we get to verse 33, I just got to say, this is my favorite verse in this text, at least the way that Jacob says this first part here, because everything we know about him makes these next few words just hilariously good gold to me. "So my honesty will answer for me later." The dude who stole from his brother, the dude who manipulated his disabled father, is now saying, "My honesty will answer for me." I bet he said it with a straight face and everything, too. But he says, "When you come to look into my wages with you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen." Essentially, what has just taken place here is that Jacob has just agreed to work for Laban a little while longer. And for his wages, this time he is asking for livestock in goats and sheep. But he is so done with working for Laban that he is willing to take the ones that are less than aesthetically pleasing. He says, "I'll take the ones that are spotted, the ones that are speckled, the ones that are black. I'll take those off of your hands because I know you don't want those anyway." And he's just doing everything that he can to try to make Laban see reason. If Laban's not going to let him leave without taking something, okay, well then give me the ones that are spotted and speckled. Just let me get out of here, man. That's all Jacob is asking for. And Laban agrees. He says, yeah, we'll do that. That's a good agreement for me. It gets rid of the speckled and spotted lambs. Gets rid of them. I get to have the good-looking lambs and goats. This will be great. But then Laban does something that is objectively underhanded. And it's almost like in a mustache-twirling villain sort of way. Like if this were a cartoon, he would definitely be wearing all black. He'd have the mustache that goes out to here, and he'd be, oh, yeah. I don't know what that voice was. But he says, but this is what he does in verses 35 and 36. It says, but that day, Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Essentially what Laban has done is, sure, I'll give you all the striped and spotted and speckled and all that other less than aesthetically pleasing sheep and goats. You can have those as your wages. But then he tells his kids, hey, go take all of those and get out of here. Go hide them so that Jacob can't take them. What a guy, man. Because while Jacob is taking care of the other part of Laban's flock, it takes time for animals to breed. It takes time for those sheep and those goats, those little ones to grow and be able to prosper and go off and flock and be able to be moved properly. And so I want you to know that I spent a great deal of time. I don't usually like to pull back the curtain this far, but I spent hours this week trying to really figure out, see if I could understand the next part of Genesis chapter 30. Essentially what happens is that Jacob utilized carved rods, and these carved rods are somehow able to entice the sheep and the goats into mating with one another. And so Jacob would set out these rods only when the strong of all the sheep and the goats were out there, so that they would be enticed to mate. When all the weaker or the more feeble or whatever else sheep and goats would come out, Jacob would remove those rods. And whenever the newborn lambs would come out, or goats, whatever they're called, he would remove the ones that were striped and speckled, and they would all be strong. And something about having those rods out there, I don't get it, but it made those particular animals breed like crazy. The ones that were more feeble and weak didn't want to breed at all. Again, I looked into all sorts of other stuff. I watched a few videos. I read some commentaries. And ultimately, the best thing I can give you, if you really want to understand what Jacob did here, I can't guarantee you're still going to understand it, is to read the 1997 article by Scott Nagel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that article is entitled Sex, Sticks, and the Trickster in Genesis 30, 31 through 43. I have a copy of that article right here. I'd be glad to make you a copy if you want one, so you can find out, because I love learning. Hopefully you love learning too. But I will give you this. The title is probably the only part of this that is actually attention grabbing. The rest of this is fascinating in a I need a nap, so I'm going to read this sort of way. But let me know if you want a copy. But long, weird story short, the end result is that the sheep that were striped and speckled that Jacob is now in charge of vastly outnumber the more traditionally pleasing ones that now belong to Laban. And in the first verses of chapter 31, Laban's sons start to think that something is afoot here. Something about this whole thing doesn't smell right. They think that Jacob might even be stealing from their father. And they start putting that into Laban's head. And right around that time, Jacob is already starting to figure out that Laban doesn't feel quite as strongly towards me as he used to. Something about my uncle father-in-law now has kind of turned sour. And it's about that time in verse 3 that Jacob has another dream communication with God. It says this, then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. We need to understand the temperature in this entire situation is turning up. Right? There is now tension between Jacob and Laban. And it's not just the tension of Laban has once again manipulated Jacob into doing what he wants. A tension is starting to shift. Because now Jacob, the proverbial golden goose for Laban, it appears like he's stealing from Laban. That he himself is trying to manipulate Laban out of more sheep and goats to take as his wages. And Laban's sons are getting angry about this because they think that he is taking wealth away from their father. If we're honest, they're also probably concerned that he is taking away part of their inheritance. Isn't it interesting how so many conflicts in this world ultimately come down to money? So Jacob has this dream where God says, it's time for you to go home, and don't worry, I'm going to be with you. Jacob doesn't know what's going to happen. All he has is a promise from God that God will be with him. Jacob doesn't know how any of this is going to shake out. He doesn't know if his family is going to be able to safely travel back to his homeland without Laban getting angry or upset or even trying to harm them in some way. All he knows is that God will be with him. He has no clue how any of this will turn out. Only has the promise of God saying, I will be. Jacob tells his wives and his kids that it's time for us to make like a tree and leave. They come to the conclusion that now is actually a really great time for us to do that because Laban is away for a few days. He's off shearing his sheep. My brother used to raise sheep for 4-H. He only had like 3 or 4 at a time. When he would want to shear them, he had electric razors. In this ancient culture, Laban would have had thousands of sheep and he wouldn't have electricity, so no electric razor. So this would take days for him to be able to do this. And oftentimes after they finished shearing the sheep, they would kind of celebrate that that job is over with a great big party. And so maybe they're thinking that if we can get away now, we've got an extra day because Laban will just be, too hungover to come and chase after us. And so they decide to do that. But even though Laban is away and even though he's not going to be coming home for a while, they still leave at night. And when they leave, Rachel does something interesting. Because we see it in verse 19. It said, Laban had gone out to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole father's household gods. That's a weird choice, isn't it? The last time we spoke about Rachel in this narrative, it was after she had had Joseph, after pleading with God and asking God to give her more, but so far in the narrative, that hasn't happened yet. Now she's stealing her father's household idols. That feels so random for that to happen, doesn't it? Again, keep it in the back of your mind. But these are the very same gods that Laban himself used to discern that God was at work in Jacob. Right? These are the household idols that Laban has relied on his entire life. They're important to Laban. They have great significance to him and to his family. And now Rachel has made off with them. And so when Laban comes home a couple of days later and he sees Jacob and his family are gone, my household idols are also gone, and my sons were accusing Jacob of stealing from me just before he left, Laban is less than pleased. On the one hand, maybe he's just hurt because he didn't get to say goodbye to his daughters or his grandkids, and Jacob is just up and left. And so maybe he's hurt by this particular action. But I'm willing to bet it's so much deeper than that. See, I'm willing to bet that Laban is angry. He's angry because he believes that Jacob has stolen from him. And in this culture, in this time period, there was really only one punishment for thievery. Either you get your hand cut off or you die. Usually both. So Laban is all kinds of angry, and he sets off taking after Jacob, even though Jacob has a couple of days head start on him. It takes Laban a full week to actually catch up with where Jacob is at. But just before he and Jacob have their big confrontation, just before everything that has been building to this tension-filled crescendo comes to its peak, Laban has a dream. And in that dream, God speaks to him in verse 24. It says, but God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night, and he said to him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Kind of interesting that God would phrase it that way, isn't it? I know I've asked you to put a couple of things in the back of your head. Put this one here too, because I think it's going to be important later. But understand, when they are finally face to face with each other, all of the tension that has been brewing for so very long is right here. This is the apex. This is the crescendo. This is the main event of WrestleMania, right? Everything we've been doing builds up to this. Okay, maybe that's just me. But it gets to this point, and Laban asked Jacob why he would break his uncle father-in-law's heart. And he says, why did you leave the way that he did? In fact, he asks him in verses 28 and 29, it says, Laban said, and why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. The reality and the truth of the situation is that Jacob needed to get away from a very toxic relationship in his life. But notice that Laban says there in verse 29, it is in my power to do you harm. This is not a simple, light thing. I mean, technically speaking, at any point in time, we have the power to do harm to other people. This is Laban drawing attention to that. Again, he thinks that Jacob may have stolen some sheep and some livestock, the symbols of wealth and prosperity in this time period. He thinks that Jacob may have stolen those from them. He knows that the household gods are missing ever so conveniently at the same time that Jacob has left. But more than that, Jacob has been the golden goose, and now the golden goose has betrayed me. It's very likely that Laban is so angry that when he says it's in my power to do you harm, what he means is, I want to kill you. But because your God said not to, I won't. Jacob, of course, pleads innocence in all of this, and he tells Laban, if you want to go and look my entire camp, you can. If you find your household gods, you can treat whoever they're found with the way that you would a common criminal. As he's doing so, Rachel, who has the idols, she hides them under a camel skin, and she sits down on it, telling her father, I cannot stand for you right now because I'm on my period. And so Laban does not come anywhere near that. She's able to successfully deceive her father in the midst of all of this. And again, we have to ask the question, why does Rachel need these gods? But Laban finally admits defeat. He comes back to Jacob, hat in hand, telling him, I didn't find him anywhere. And it's when Jacob hears that Laban is defeated, having already heard that God has appeared to Laban warning him, Jacob finally cuts it all loose. 20 years of bent up frustration and manipulation and resentment and anger about the ways that Laban has treated him all the way from the beginning. He lets it all out. Jacob tells him, I have always worked hard for you. I have always prospered you as to the best of my ability. He even goes so far as to say that none of the sheep or lambs miscarried while they were under my care. It's probably because Jacob didn't let them breed in the first place, but neither here nor there. But he fires it all off into the crescendo, the peak, the main point of what he's getting to in verses 41 and 42. He's saying, these 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and I love the way he phrases this for some reason, the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Whew. All of it is out in the open now. All the ways that Jacob has resented his uncle father-in-law for the last 20 years is now laid bare. And the two of them kind of eventually calmed down. And when they do, they kind of come to a mutual agreement here. They kind of figure out the best thing for them. They set up a pillar. And this pillar is there for a couple of reasons. It's there to symbolize that God is watching both of them from opposite ends of the pillar. That he is observing what each one of them are doing and that he will be the one to ultimately judge between them. But this pillar also serves as a boundary marker. Because the idea now is that the healthiest thing for both of us is if we don't come anywhere near each other anymore. So this pillar is going to stand as a boundary that if Jacob sees that he or his family is getting too close to it, he calls them back. If Laban has his flocks too far out and they see that pillar, then they know they got to pull it back. Because the healthiest thing for all of them is to just completely separate it. It'll only lead to more hurt or resentment or manipulation. And then finally, much to the relief of Jacob, verse 55, early in the morning, Laban arose, kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and blessed them. And then Laban departed and returned home. You can almost feel that minute as Laban leaves, that Jacob's shoulders unclench. That he is able to breathe deep for the first time in 2 decades. Because it's over. Jacob had no idea how any of this was going to go. He was probably stressed out of his mind, worried about if Laban is going to come and kill me and my family. But because he trusted God, it all worked out exactly the way it should. Jacob is now free to kind of go and start his life and make the wealth for him and his family. He's no longer under the thumb of Laban. That was intense. But at the heart of it now, Jacob knows one thing for certain. He can trust God. I mean, before he came to Haran 20 years ago, he had that dream where God appeared before him saying, I'll be your God. You can trust that. He's now heard from God a second time saying, even though the situation is tense and even though it's uncomfortable for you, I'm still going to be with you. Now he has seen practically, knowing that his life was at risk in the midst of all of this, God has been with him. He can trust God. He got all of this out. He settled everything between Jacob and Laban because he could lean on that one single promise. God will be with him. Because ultimately that's what this story is all about. Jacob trusting God to get away from a toxic environment, to get away from a situation that felt like it could cost him his very life. But what's really interesting in this narrative is how much it points out the 2 people who did not trust God. See, Laban profited from Jacob for 20 years because, as Laban himself pointed out, God had been at work in Jacob. That means that Laban for 20 years had a front row seat to see all the things that this God could do. But he still trusted his idols more. The same gods that before Jacob arrived hadn't given him any sort of wealth or prosperity. He still leaned on them more. 20 years he got to see the fruit of what God could make happen. He still didn't trust him. In fact, that's kind of why I think God worded things the way that he did in Laban's dream, where he said, don't do anything towards Jacob, good or evil. Because if you remember back to that promise that God made to Jacob a couple of weeks ago that we discussed, he told him that I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. So while God doesn't want to curse Laban, he also doesn't want to bless him. He doesn't want to bless the man who for 20 years has seen how God moves and still refuses to trust him. But more than that, when Rachel had finally had the birth of Joseph, 6 years before all of this melodrama, her response was, I want more. And I doubt that that's the only time that she ever told God, I want more kids than just Joseph. She has pleaded with God over and over and over again, but after 6 years, it still has not happened. And in fact, most scholars think it would be another 6 to 8 years before Benjamin would come around. So after 6 years of pleading with God to give me more children, she has learned that God is either not going to do this or that I can't trust God. So instead, she steals her father's idols. Most biblical scholars think that this is because she trusted them to make her fertile. Because if you remember, in the ancient world, most of the gods and the household idols that were there were household idols that were for fertility. They would pray to these gods in the hopes that their crops would come in, or that they would have plenty of livestock, or that they would be able to have plenty of children. So after 6 years of pleading with God to give me another son, Rachel is now saying, if he's not going to, maybe these gods will. Because I can't trust that God. But the one in this narrative who trusted God completely was shown that God is always worthy of complete trust. You might be sitting there right now and you might be kind of shaking your heads a little bit and thinking, wow, another sermon where the whole point is trust God. Yippee. Let me ask you this, and let me ask you this seriously. I really want you to think about this for yourself. Have you ever put your trust of God to the test? See, God called Jacob to place his trust in God when he had no clue what the outcome was. And yet, even though this is one of thousands of stories in Scripture that point to the idea that God is trustworthy, we still don't trust him. I'm completely honest, completely transparent with you. I still don't trust him. I think some of that is because God doesn't deal in spoilers. He doesn't tell us how things are going to end. He didn't tell Jacob how all this was going to end for him. Maybe if God told us the end, maybe if God could tell us the end result of what this all would be, then maybe we'd be willing to trust him more. But instead, God simply invites us to trust him. He doesn't tell us the ending. He just tells us, I will be. Is that not enough? Laban saw for 20 years, 2 decades, what God could do. He still didn't trust God. Let me ask you this. How many decades do you need? How many more decades do I need before we start trusting God? The prophet Jeremiah would write in Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8, and we will close with it. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is in the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that seeds out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green. And is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear